All right, now we're on to our fifth PV function. In this fifth function, we're going to take this cash flow timing. This is just for the annuity, whether the annuity pays cash flows at the beginning or the end of the period. As a reminder, 0 for Excel is set to begin the end of the period, which is more standard, whereas a 1 is going to flip it to the beginning of the period. So notice that when we flipped it, our fourth function doesn't match, so we want to build that optionality in here. So this is going to be where we're going to, again, copy the function, make a new version of it with a slight tweak. So let's go over to VBA. Let's copy our function. Right, it's getting a little bit bigger function now. And then paste at the bottom. Again, I'd like to make some room here. That looks pretty good. So what we're going to add here is we need that fifth argument. So up here at the top, I'm going to put timing. And here I'm going to use an integer type. Because you notice for Excel, it's only a 0 or a 1. So we don't need it to be 1.2 or 10% or anything like that. So let's just use integer for that 0, 1 data type. For what it's worth, we could use a Boolean here, if you were familiar with that term. We're going to keep it simple and just use an integer for the time being. Now, what changes about the calculation is down here with the annuity value. Right? If the timing is 0, well, we're done. We've already figured it out. If the timing, though, is 1, where it happens at the beginning of the period, we need to move the annuity value around. In fact, we need to push the annuity value forward 1 period to account for the fact we're getting our cash flows at the beginning of the period. So we got to adjust by 1 plus r. But how can we do that, right? So we can think about two different calculations here. The second calculation, all we're going to do is take this initial annuity value and multiply it by 1 plus the interest rate. All right, so we have 1 plus the interest rate there, but now we have to pick between these two functions. We don't know which of these calculations is going to be right, but it depends on what the user puts in for this timing variable. This is where an if statement comes in. And this is very similar to using the if function within Excel. We can just use an if-then command. So this is going to be our first logical command we use in our function. So here I'm going to type if, and I'm going to say if timing is equal to 0, then. All right, so by hitting if timing is equal to 0, then, now we have the start of our if statement. So on the next line, if that's true, that timing equals 0, this next line of code is going to execute. We can then add a second command, else if timing equals 1, then. Finally, I'm going to put an end if here at the end. So there's a lot here. We'll kind of walk through each of these pieces. Before we walk through the logic, one thing I like to do is just use my tab to make my code a little bit more readable. Whenever you have if statements or loops that we're going to see in a couple of videos, you want to keep your code organized so you know what happens within that if statement. In this case, what happens between this if and the next else if is this line of code. All right, so I'm going to indent everything in that line. That way it kind of stays together in a clump. All right, again, this is just going to improve readability. It's not necessary, but it makes it a little easier to follow your code for yourself and for other users as well. So now let's talk about the logic. If this statement is true, that timing equals 0, then it'll execute this line of code. If it's not true, it's going to skip over it, and it won't actually do this calculation. It then gets to this next statement, else if timing equals 1. So if timing equals 1, if that's true, it'll execute this line of code. So we're only going to get one of these calculated because timing can't both equal 0 and 1. So we're either going to get the first annuity value or the second annuity value. Again, toggling based on what the user puts in for that timing. All right, let's flip over back to our Excel and check our formula. So right away, I start typing fifth PV, and I see that nothing's coming up. What does that mean? It probably means I messed up. So let's go flip back. And yes, I copied my formula without updating the name. I would have gotten an error if we tried to run anything. We caught it before then, so we can fix our name and make it the fifth PV function. So now if I flip over and I start typing fifth, there it shows up. And now we can do all our arguments. Cash flow, periods, periodic cash flow, future cash flow, and now our timing. So now we got something that is matching exactly to that first function. It's matching when it equals 1. If we flip that to 0, it still matches. So the function is now changing based on whether the user is putting a 0 or a 1 in. What if we put a 2 in? Now the Excel function still works. It has a way of doing some error handling. We don't though, because timing was not equal to 0, it was not equal to 1, so neither of our annuity values calculated. So all we have now is that present value piece, which is the present value of this future value, which is that $7.83. So we'll talk in future videos about how to handle error handling like this, and when users put in things you don't expect. But for now, let's just flip this back to a 1, so everything's working for us. All right, the last step I want to add to this function before we go on is the ability to make this an optional argument. So an optional argument is like what we saw in Excel. And let's flip back. If we click on our PV function in Excel, and actually let's go into our function, we see that these two, future value and type, are both light gray. Let me actually type this function again so we see it a little bit better. So if we type PV, now you can see right here that FV and type are both in brackets. That's indicating that those are optional arguments that you don't have to include. All right, so how do we do that as well in our function? Right, because ours is not optional right now. If we go through here and delete out that last argument, we're going to get a value error because it needs to know beginning or end of period. So to account for that, I'm going to flip over, and we're going to call this last argument optional. All right, that one word optional tells us that that variable is going to be optional, so we don't have to include it. So now if we flip back, take our last argument off, we're still getting an answer that works. Let me just copy that and move it down here. Notice I didn't lock my cell references, so everything got messed up. So let me just lock everything real quick. So we lock, we move down, and now let me show you when we take this off, the function works. Does it give me the right answer? Not really. It's basically ignoring that last argument and assuming it's a 0. So if we choose 0, everything lines up. If we choose 1, it doesn't necessarily work anymore. And that's the same thing Excel does. If we take the last argument off as well, it also assumes a 0, so it's no longer going to react to changes in that cash flow timing. So that allowed us, though, to introduce that optional argument. Let's fix our Excel function again. And so now we can either choose to use that argument or not.